back to the UK and was speaking at the Keswick Convention in the Lake District, and he threw in these 3 testimonies. At the close of his teaching session, 4 elderly pastors came up and said, "We got saved between 25 and 35 years ago, respectively, through that little man on George Street giving us a tract and asking us those questions." He then flew the following week to a similar Keswick convention in the Caribbean to missionaries and shared the testimonies. At the close of his teaching session, 3 missionaries came up and said, "We got saved between 15 and 25 years ago, respectively, through that little man's testimony and asking us the same question on George Street, Sydney." Coming back to London, he stopped outside Atlanta, Georgia, to speak at a naval chaplains convention. And when his 3 days of revving over 1,000 naval chaplains up on soul winning, the chaplain general took him out for a meal. He asked the general how he had become a Christian. The general said, "Well, it was miraculous. I was a rating on a United States battleship and I lived a reprobate life. We were doing exercises in the South Pacific and we docked in Sydney Harbour for repairs. We hit King's Cross with a vengeance. I got blind drunk. I got on the wrong bus and got off at George Street. As I got off the bus, I thought it was a ghost. This elderly, white-haired man jumped in front of me, pushed a pamphlet in my hand and said, 'Sailor, are you saved? If you died tonight, are you going to heaven?' He said, the fear of God hit me immediately. I was shocked, sober, and ran back to the battleship. I sought out the chaplain, and soon the chaplain led me to Christ, and I soon began to prepare for the ministry under his guidance. Here I am, in charge of over 1,000 chaplains, and we're bent on soul winning today." That London preacher, 6 months later, flew to do a convention for 5,000 Indian missionaries in a remote corner of northeastern India. And at the end, the Indian missionary in charge, a humble little man, took him to his simple little home for a simple meal. He asked the Indian, "How did you, as a Hindu, come to Christ?" He said, "I was in a very privileged position. I worked for the Indian diplomatic service and travelled the world. I'm so glad for the forgiveness of Christ, his blood covering my sin, because I'd be very embarrassed if people found out what I got into. One bout of diplomatic service took me to Sydney, and I was doing some last-minute shopping, parcels of toys and clothing for my children, walking down George Street, when this courteous little man stepped out in front of me, offered me a pamphlet and said, 'Excuse me, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven?' He said, I thanked him very much, but this disturbed me. I got back to my town. I sought out the Hindu priest, and he couldn't help me, but he gave me some advice. He said, just to satisfy your curious mind, nothing else, go and talk to the missionary in the house at the end of the road. That was fatal advice, because that day the missionary led me to Christ. I quit Hinduism immediately and began to study for the ministry. I left the diplomatic service, and here I am, by God's grace, in charge of all these missionaries, and we're winning hundreds of thousands of people to Christ. Well, 8 months later, that Crystal Palace Baptist pastor was ministering in a southern suburb of Sydney. And he said to the Baptist minister, "Do you know a little man, an elderly little man, who witnesses and hands out tracts on George Street?" "I do," he said. "His name is Mr. Gaynor, but I don't think he does it anymore. He's too frail and elderly." The pastor asked to meet him. 2 nights later, they went around to this little apartment and knocked on the door. A tiny, frail little man opened the door. He sat them down and made some tea. He was so frail, he was slopping the tea into the saucer as he shook. As he sat there, this London preacher told him all these accounts over the previous 3 years. This little man sat with tears running down his cheeks. He said, "My story goes like this. I was a rating on an Australian warship, and I lived a reprobate life, and in a crisis I really hit the wall, and one of my colleagues, to whom I gave literal hell, was there to help me. He led me to Jesus, and the change in my life was night to day in 24 hours. I was so grateful to God. I promised God that I would share Jesus in a simple witness with at least 10 people a day as God gave me strength. Sometimes I was ill and I couldn't do it, but I made up for it at other times. I wasn't paranoid about it. I've done this for over 40 years, and in my retirement years, the best place was on George Street. There were hundreds of people there. I got lots of rejection, but a lot of people courteously took the tract that I gave them. In 40 years of doing this, I have never heard of one single person coming to Jesus until today. Mr. Gaynor died 2 weeks later. Mr. Gaynor spoke to 10 people a day, 3,650 people a year. This simple, little, non-charismatic, non-Pentecostal Baptist man influenced 146,100 people over 40 years. He had not heard of one person coming to Christ over that time. Can you imagine the reward he went home to in heaven? Nobody except a little group of Baptists in southern Sydney knew about Mr. Gaynor, but his name was famous in heaven.